Marcus, I need to show you something that's going to change everything we thought we knew about your father. I whispered those words to my grandson as my hands trembled around the small black device we'd just discovered. For 6 months, I'd been living in what I believed was the safety of my son's home, grateful for his care after my accident. Everyone said I was lucky to have such a devoted family. Everyone except Marcus, whose sharp eyes had started noticing things that didn't quite add up. What we found that Tuesday afternoon wasn't just a violation of my privacy, it was evidence of something so twisted, so carefully planned, that when the full truth emerged, it would force us to question everything about the man I'd raised and trusted with my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Sullivan, and at 73, I thought I'd seen enough of life's surprises to handle whatever came my way. For 35 years, I taught high school English in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, shaping young minds and watching them grow into capable adults. I'd weathered my husband Robert's death from cancer, raised 3 children as a single mother, and maintained my independence in the little blue house on Maple Street where I'd lived for 4 decades. I gardened, volunteered at the local library, and drove myself to book club every Thursday without fail. Then came the fall that changed everything. It happened on a crisp October morning while I was cleaning gutters, something I'd done dozens of times before without incident. The ladder slipped on wet leaves, and I plummeted 12 feet onto the concrete driveway. The impact shattered my left hip and cracked 2 ribs, but the real damage was to my confidence. Lying in that hospital bed for 2 weeks, staring at a future that suddenly included physical therapy and mobility aids, I felt older than I ever had in my life. My son Thomas appeared at my bedside the day before my discharge, his weathered face creased with what looked like genuine concern. "Mom, you can't go back to that house alone, not with stairs and all that maintenance. What if you fall again and nobody finds you for hours?" Thomas was 48, recently divorced, and had been struggling to find his footing since his wife left him 6 months earlier. He worked construction when the weather was good and odd jobs when it wasn't, living in a small rental house across town that barely accommodated his sparse furniture and growing collection of empty beer bottles. "The doctors say I'll be fine with some physical therapy," I told him, though even I could hear the uncertainty in my voice. "The physical therapist wants me using a walker for at least 6 weeks, and these ribs still ache when I breathe deeply." Thomas leaned forward in his chair, his calloused hands clasping mine with surprising gentleness. "I've been thinking about this for days, Mom. My place has everything on 1 floor. No stairs, no ladders to tempt you into doing dangerous maintenance. I could keep an eye on you while you recover, make sure you're eating properly and taking your medications on schedule." The offer touched something deep in my chest. Thomas had always been my most distant child, the one who called only on holidays and visited even less frequently. After his divorce, our conversations had become stilted affairs filled with awkward silences and mutual concern about topics we were afraid to address directly. If he was offering to care for me, perhaps this could be an opportunity to rebuild the relationship I'd always hoped we might have. "I don't want to be a burden, sweetheart. You're dealing with your own changes right now, and I know having your mother underfoot isn't exactly what you had in mind for this phase of your life. You're not a burden, Mom. You're family. And honestly, having someone else in the house might be good for me too. It gets pretty quiet there in the evenings." 3 days later, Thomas loaded my belongings into his pickup truck and drove me to his small ranch house on the outskirts of town. The house was modest but clean, with beige walls and minimal furniture that suggested its occupant spent most of his time elsewhere. Thomas had cleared out his spare bedroom, installing a shower chair in the adjacent bathroom and moving a small television onto the dresser. "I set up your medications on the kitchen counter," he said, showing me a plastic organizer with compartments for morning and evening doses. "The doctor gave me a complete list of everything you're supposed to take and when. I figured it would be easier if I handled that part of your routine, at least until you're feeling steadier on your feet." That first week passed peacefully enough. Thomas left for work before sunrise and returned in the early evening, usually carrying takeout containers from local restaurants. He'd ask about my day, help me with physical therapy exercises the hospital had prescribed, and settle into his recliner to watch television while I read or worked on crossword puzzles. Our conversations were still somewhat stilted, but there was an easiness to our routine that I hadn't expected. The pain medications made me drowsy most afternoons, and I found myself napping more than I had in years. Thomas assured me this was normal for someone recovering from significant trauma, and my body needed rest to heal properly. When I apologized for sleeping so much, he waved away my concerns with a patience that surprised me. "Sleep all you want, Mom. That's what recovery looks like. Don't push yourself to do more than feels comfortable." By the second week, I began noticing small changes in Thomas's behavior that seemed connected to my presence in his home. He'd always been somewhat private, but now he seemed almost secretive about his activities. He installed new locks on his bedroom door, explaining that construction tools and important paperwork were stored there and he didn't want me accidentally hurting myself on something sharp. He moved his computer from the living room into his bedroom, saying he preferred the privacy when paying bills or checking email. Most notably, he began leaving the house for long periods on weekends, claiming he was visiting friends or running errands that would bore me. These absences stretched from a few hours to entire afternoons, during which he'd call periodically to check on me but offer vague explanations about his whereabouts. "I'm just grabbing some supplies from the hardware store and catching up with Dale about a potential job next week," he'd say, when I asked about his plans. "Nothing interesting enough to drag you along for, especially with you still getting around slowly on that walker." The isolation didn't bother me initially. I was still adjusting to my reduced mobility and found plenty to occupy my time with books, daytime television, and phone calls to old friends. But as weeks passed, I began feeling increasingly disconnected from the world beyond Thomas's small house. My car remained parked at my own house across town, and Thomas discouraged me from driving until my doctor officially cleared me for full activity. "Better safe than sorry," he'd say when I mentioned wanting to visit my old neighborhood or attend book club meetings. "You don't want to have another accident before you're completely healed." Marcus, my grandson and Thomas's nephew through his ex-wife's family, had always been the bridge between the different branches of our extended family. At 19, he was studying computer science at the community college and working part-time at an electronics store downtown. Unlike his uncle Thomas, Marcus was naturally curious and talkative, with an easy smile and the kind of restless energy that made him notice details others might overlook. He'd been visiting me regularly since childhood, usually stopping by after school or work to share stories about his classes or ask advice about decisions he was facing. When I moved into Thomas's house, Marcus continued these visits, though I noticed Thomas seemed less enthusiastic about his nephew's presence than he had been about my own. "The kid talks too much," Thomas complained after one of Marcus's visits. "Always asking questions about things that aren't his business. Sometimes I think he's just looking for something to worry about." But Marcus's questions never bothered me. If anything, his visits were the highlights of my weeks, bringing energy and laughter into what had become a fairly quiet existence. He'd update me on his computer classes, show me new gadgets he was learning about at work, and listen with genuine interest to stories about my teaching days or memories of his grandfather Robert. It was during one of these visits in late November that Marcus first mentioned noticing something unusual about the house's setup. "Aunt Margaret, has Uncle Thomas always been so interested in electronics?" He asked the question casually while helping me organize my medications, but something in his tone suggested deeper curiosity. "Not particularly. Why do you ask?" I noticed he's got some pretty sophisticated equipment in his bedroom. Cables running under doors, multiple monitors, stuff that seems like overkill for just paying bills and checking email. Plus there are these tiny holes drilled in walls that look pretty fresh. They're small, but once you notice them, they're everywhere. I tried to recall seeing any evidence of new electrical work, but my mobility had been limited to the main living areas and my bedroom. Thomas's bedroom remained off-limits, and I'd respected his privacy without question. Maybe he's been doing some kind of home improvement project. You know how men get about their gadgets and workshop spaces. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. Maybe, it just seems like a lot of equipment for someone who barely uses a smartphone. Over the following days, I found myself paying more attention to details I'd previously ignored. There were indeed small holes in several walls, precisely drilled and barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for them. Thin cables snaked along baseboards and disappeared behind furniture in ways that seemed designed to be invisible to casual observation. Most puzzling were the tiny dark spots I began noticing in corners near the ceiling, so small they looked like nail holes or natural imperfections in the paint. When I asked Thomas about the electrical work, his explanation was casual but oddly detailed for someone who usually offered minimal information about his activities. "I've been upgrading the house's internet and cable setup," he said while preparing my evening medications. The previous tenant had everything running through old, slow connections that couldn't handle modern streaming and internet demands. "I'm just trying to bring everything up to current standards." The explanation made sense, but something about his tone suggested he'd prepared the answer in advance, as if anticipating the question. That weekend, Thomas left for another of his mysterious errands, promising to return by evening with dinner from my favorite Chinese restaurant.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
I was reading in the living room when Marcus arrived unexpectedly, carrying a small electronic device I didn't recognize. "I brought something I wanted to show you," he said, settling into the chair beside my recliner. "This is a signal detector we use at the electronics store to identify different types of wireless transmissions. I've been thinking about those holes and cables I mentioned, and I wanted to check something." "Check what exactly?" Marcus turned on the device and immediately it began emitting a series of beeps that grew faster and more insistent as he moved it around the room. The beeping became almost frantic when he pointed it toward the corners where I'd noticed those tiny dark spots. "Aunt Margaret, these aren't just cable upgrades, these are cameras. Multiple cameras, all transmitting signals to some kind of central recording system." The words hit me like ice water. "Cameras? What do you mean cameras?" Marcus stood up and examined one of the dark spots more closely, his face grim. "These are wireless surveillance cameras, probably motion activated and recording continuously. From what I can tell with this detector, there are at least 6 of them just in this room." My mind reeled as I tried to process what he was telling me. Thomas has been recording me, but why would he do that? What possible reason could he have? "I don't know, but we need to find out. Do you mind if I check your bedroom?" We moved slowly down the hallway, my walker making soft clicking sounds on the hardwood floor while Marcus swept the detection device methodically around my sleeping area. The beeping was even more pronounced here, indicating multiple transmission sources. "Aunt Margaret, there are cameras in here too. At least 3 that I can detect, positioned to cover the entire room from different angles." The violation felt physical, like discovering someone had been watching me through windows I'd believed were private. For 2 months I'd been living, sleeping, changing clothes, and recovering from injury under constant surveillance without my knowledge or consent. Every private moment, every vulnerable instance of physical therapy or personal care, had potentially been recorded and stored somewhere, for reasons I couldn't begin to imagine. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "First, we need to find where Uncle Thomas is storing these recordings. Based on the equipment I saw glimpses of in his bedroom, I'm guessing he's got a pretty sophisticated setup back there. But we need to be careful. If he's been doing this secretly, he's not going to react well to being discovered." Marcus checked his watch and calculated how much time we had before Thomas's expected return. "He usually stays out until evening when he goes on these weekend trips. That gives us maybe 3 hours to investigate and figure out what we're dealing with." The locked door to Thomas's bedroom had always seemed like a reasonable boundary to respect, but now it felt ominous and threatening. Marcus examined the lock carefully, noting that it was a relatively new deadbolt installation that seemed out of proportion to the modest security needs of a small house. "This isn't just about privacy," he said, running his fingers along the doorframe. "This is about keeping people out of something specific." Using tools from Thomas's own workshop, Marcus carefully worked on the lock mechanism while I kept watch from the living room window. The process took nearly 20 minutes, but eventually the door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the quiet house. What we found inside Thomas's bedroom made my knees weak with shock and disbelief. The space had been transformed into an elaborate surveillance center that looked more like something from a police procedural than a construction worker's personal bedroom. Multiple monitors covered one entire wall, displaying live feeds from cameras throughout the house. I could see myself on several screens, captured from angles I'd never realized existed and in detail that made me feel exposed and vulnerable. But the cameras monitoring me were only part of the setup. Additional screens showed feeds from other locations I didn't recognize, including what appeared to be other private residences and possibly businesses. File cabinets lined another wall, labeled with dates and names that included my own alongside others I didn't know. Marcus moved to the computer setup and began accessing files while I stood frozen in the doorway, trying to process the magnitude of what we'd discovered. "Aunt Margaret, you need to see this," Marcus said, his voice tight with anger and disgust. "He's got months of recordings of you. Hours and hours of footage from every day since you moved in here. But that's not all. What else?" Marcus opened additional files that revealed the true scope of Thomas's activities. He wasn't just surveilling me, he was running some kind of broader operation that involved multiple subjects and what appeared to be financial transactions related to the recorded material. He's been selling access to these recordings online. There are payment records, customer communications and subscription lists for people who are paying to watch live feeds or download archived footage. The realization that my most private moments had not only been recorded without my consent, but monetized and distributed to strangers felt like a physical blow. I gripped my walker tighter, fighting waves of nausea and rage. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus scrolled through file dates and transaction records, his expression growing darker with each discovery. "Based on these records, he started setting up cameras shortly after you moved in. But there are other locations too, and some of those go back months or even years. We found evidence that Thomas had been targeting vulnerable individuals, elderly people, people recovering from injuries or illnesses, people who trusted him enough to allow him into their homes for various services or assistance. My situation wasn't unique. I was simply his most recent victim in what appeared to be a systematic pattern of exploitation." The sound of a car door slamming in the driveway sent both of us into panic mode. Thomas was returning hours earlier than expected, and we were trapped in his bedroom with evidence of activities that could destroy multiple lives if exposed. "We have to get out of here right now," Marcus whispered, quickly closing computer files and grabbing several storage devices that contained the most damaging evidence. "Can you move faster than usual?" "I have to," I replied, adrenaline overriding the pain in my still healing hip. We managed to exit Thomas's bedroom and relock the door just as his key turned in the front entrance. Marcus slipped the storage devices into his backpack while I settled into my usual chair, trying to control my breathing and appear casual. "Hey Mom, hey Marcus," Thomas called out, carrying bags from the Chinese restaurant as promised. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," he added, looking at his nephew with what seemed like increased scrutiny. "I just stopped by to check on Aunt Margaret and help her with a few things around the house," Marcus replied smoothly. "I was about to head home when you arrived." Thomas's eyes moved between us, and I wondered if he could sense the tension that felt so obvious to me. "Everything okay here? You both look a little flustered." "I'm just tired from physical therapy exercises," I managed to say. Marcus was helping me practice walking without the walker, and it's more exhausting than I expected. The explanation seemed to satisfy Thomas, who unpacked our dinner while making casual conversation about his day. But I noticed him watching both of us more carefully than usual, and when Marcus left after dinner, Thomas walked him to the door and spoke quietly in the driveway for several minutes. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal haze of normal domestic routine, layered over my new awareness of constant surveillance. Every movement felt calculated and observed. Every word seemed potentially recorded and analyzed. The home I'd thought of as a safe haven for recovery had become a prison of violation and exploitation. When Thomas brought my evening medications, his familiar gesture of care felt sinister and controlling. When he asked about my day, his questions felt like interrogation designed to assess whether I'd discovered anything suspicious. When he said goodnight and retreated to his bedroom, I knew he was settling in front of monitors to watch recorded footage of my most private moments. I lay awake most of that night, staring at the ceiling and trying to identify which of the tiny imperfections might be camera lenses. The darkness that had once felt restful and private now felt oppressive and threatening. Every sound seemed amplified, every movement felt exposed. By morning I'd made a decision that would change everything. Thomas couldn't be allowed to continue exploiting vulnerable people, and whatever relationship we'd had as mother and son was already destroyed by his betrayal. The only question was how to protect myself, and gather enough evidence to ensure he faced consequences for what he'd been doing. When Marcus called the next morning while Thomas was at work, I was ready with a plan. "We can't confront him directly," I told my grandson. "He's too smart and too prepared for that kind of approach. But we also can't let this continue, or pretend we don't know what he's been doing." "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need help from people with more resources and authority than we have. But first, we need to make sure we have copies of everything important. Because once Thomas realizes we know about the cameras, he's going to try to destroy evidence as quickly as possible." Over the following week, Marcus and I developed a careful strategy for documenting Thomas's illegal surveillance operation while avoiding detection. Marcus used his technical knowledge to access and copy files when Thomas was at work, while I began documenting patterns in his behavior and keeping detailed notes about the scope of his activities. We discovered that Thomas's operation was even more extensive than we'd initially realized. He had cameras installed in at least 12 different locations, including the homes of several other elderly clients who'd hired him for various maintenance and assistance services. His customer base for the recorded material included hundreds of subscribers paying monthly fees for access to live feeds and archived footage. The financial records showed that Thomas had been earning substantial income from this illegal enterprise, significantly more than his legitimate construction work provided. He'd been using his access to vulnerable people's homes to install surveillance equipment, then profiting from their violation in ways that made me feel sick to contemplate. But perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Thomas had been systematically targeting people he identified as isolated and unlikely to discover his surveillance. He kept detailed profiles of his victims, including information about their family relationships, health conditions, and social connections that helped him assess their vulnerability and the likelihood of detection. My own profile was extensive and coldly calculated. Thomas had noted my isolation following Robert's death, my limited contact with neighbors since the accident, and my increasing dependence on medications that made me drowsy and less observant. He'd even documented my relationship with Marcus, identifying my grandson as the primary threat to his operation's security. Reading those files felt like discovering that the son I'd raised and loved had been replaced by a calculating predator who saw me only as an opportunity for exploitation. The Thomas who brought me dinner and asked about my physical therapy was the same person who analyzed my vulnerabilities and monetized my privacy for strangers' entertainment. By Thursday of that week, Marcus and I had compiled enough evidence to approach law enforcement with confidence that our accusations could be substantiated. But we also knew that once we took that step, there would be no going back to any semblance of normal family relationship. That evening, as Thomas prepared my medications with his usual show of caring attention, I watched him with the knowledge that this domestic routine was performed for an audience of paying subscribers who found entertainment in an elderly woman's dependence and vulnerability. When he handed me the pills and water glass, his fingers touched mine with what I'd once interpreted as gentle affection. Now I understood it as part of a performance designed to maximize the voyeuristic appeal of his recordings. "Sleep well, Mom," he said, just as he had every evening for months. But this time, I knew it would be one of the last times he'd have the opportunity to watch me sleep without my knowledge or consent. Tomorrow Marcus and I would set in motion a plan that would expose Thomas's crimes and free not just me, but all of his victims from the violation they didn't even know they were experiencing. The son who'd offered me safety and care had created the most dangerous situation of my entire life. And finally we were ready to fight back. Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy. Thomas left for work at his usual time, kissing my forehead and reminding me to take my medications on schedule. The gesture that had once comforted me now felt like mockery, knowing that dozens of strangers would watch me swallow those pills through cameras hidden throughout his house. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a duffel bag and wearing the grim expression of someone preparing for battle. We'd spent the previous evening finalizing our strategy, and today we would execute a plan that would either free me from this nightmare or put both of us in significant danger. The first step involved contacting Detective Sarah Chen at the Cedar Rapids Police Department. Marcus had researched which officers specialized in cyber crimes and elder abuse, identifying Detective Chen as someone with both the expertise and track record to handle our situation seriously. Her online profile showed successful prosecutions of similar cases involving illegal surveillance and exploitation of vulnerable adults. Marcus dialed the number while I sat beside him, my hands trembling with nervous energy and righteous anger. When Detective Chen answered, her voice was professional but warm, the tone of someone accustomed to hearing difficult stories and responding with appropriate gravity. Detective Chen, my name is Marcus Williams, and I need to report a serious case of illegal surveillance and elder abuse involving my aunt. We have substantial evidence of hidden cameras being used to record vulnerable adults without their consent, and the footage is being sold online to paying customers. The detective asked several preliminary questions about the scope of our allegations and the type of evidence we'd gathered. Marcus provided a careful overview without revealing that we'd accessed Thomas's files through breaking into his locked bedroom. We'd agreed to frame our discoveries as observations and technical detection rather than unauthorized entry, at least initially. This sounds like something we need to investigate immediately, Detective Chen said after hearing our summary. Can you and your aunt come to the station this afternoon to provide detailed statements and show me the evidence you've collected? We arranged to meet at 2 o'clock, giving us several hours to prepare our presentation and ensure we had copies of the most damaging files safely stored in multiple locations. Marcus had created backup drives and uploaded encrypted files to secure cloud storage, protecting our evidence from any attempts Thomas might make to destroy his computer records. The drive to the police station felt surreal and terrifying. For months I'd rarely left Thomas's house except for medical appointments, and the outside world seemed larger and more chaotic than I remembered. But alongside my anxiety was a growing sense of empowerment. Instead of being a passive victim of my son's exploitation, I was taking active steps to protect myself and others from his predatory behavior. Detective Chen met us in a small conference room equipped with computers and recording equipment. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that immediately put me at ease. Her questions were thorough but not invasive, focusing on facts and timeline rather than my emotional response to the violations. Mrs. Sullivan, I need you to walk me through exactly when you moved into your son's house and what changes you noticed in his behavior or the house setup during your stay there. I provided a detailed chronology of events, from my accident and Thomas's offer of care through the gradual discovery of surveillance equipment and evidence of his broader criminal enterprise. Detective Chen took careful notes and asked clarifying questions that demonstrated her understanding of both the technical and legal aspects of our allegations. Marcus, you mentioned using detection equipment to identify wireless cameras. Can you show me exactly what you found and explain how these devices work? Marcus unpacked his signal detector and demonstrated how it identified transmission sources throughout the house. He showed photographs he'd taken of the tiny camera installations and explained the technical specifications that indicated professional-grade surveillance equipment rather than basic home security measures. But the most compelling evidence came when Marcus opened his laptop and accessed the files we'd copied from Thomas's computer system. Detective Chen's expression grew increasingly serious as she reviewed folder after folder of recorded material, financial transactions, and victim profiles. This is extensive and highly organized, she said, scrolling through customer databases and payment records. Your son appears to have been running a sophisticated illegal surveillance operation targeting multiple vulnerable individuals over an extended period. The evidence you've gathered could support charges of invasion of privacy, elder abuse, computer crimes, and potentially federal charges related to interstate distribution of illegally obtained material. The detective explained that our case would require coordination between local police, state investigators, and possibly federal authorities depending on the scope of Thomas's online distribution network. The process would take time, but the evidence we'd provided was strong enough to justify immediate action. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you about your current living situation. Do you feel safe staying in your son's house tonight, or do you have alternative arrangements you can make while we begin our investigation? The question forced me to confront a reality I'd been avoiding. I couldn't return to Thomas's house, knowing what I now knew about his activities. Even if he didn't immediately realize we'd discovered his surveillance operation, I couldn't tolerate another night of being recorded and watched by strangers for their entertainment. I have my own house across town, but I haven't been there since my accident. I'm not sure I'm ready to manage on my own yet, with my mobility limitations. Marcus immediately offered a solution. Aunt Margaret, you can stay with me and my roommate until we figure out a more permanent arrangement. My apartment has everything on one floor, and I can help with anything you need while this investigation moves forward. Detective Chen seemed satisfied with this plan and outlined the next steps in building a case against Thomas. She would obtain warrants to search his house and seize his computer equipment while coordinating with cybercrime specialists to trace his online distribution network and identify other victims. We need to move quickly once we begin, because suspects in these cases often try to destroy evidence as soon as they realize they're under investigation. I'd like to execute search warrants tomorrow morning while your son is at work, minimizing the chances that he'll have advance warning of our investigation. The detective also explained that I would likely need to testify in court if charges were filed, describing my experience as Thomas's victim and the impact his surveillance had on my life and recovery. The prospect of facing him in a courtroom felt daunting, but I was determined to see him held accountable for what he'd done, not just to me but to all his victims. Saturday morning, Marcus picked me up at 6 o'clock for the drive to the police station, where we would observe the execution of search warrants at Thomas's house. Detective Chen had arranged for us to watch from a surveillance van as officers secured the scene and began collecting evidence. The operation unfolded with military precision. Officers surrounded the house just as Thomas left for what he'd told me was a construction job across town. The timing was perfect, allowing investigators to enter without confrontation or advance warning that might prompt him to destroy critical evidence. From our position in the surveillance van, I watched strangers in police uniforms move through the house where I'd lived for months, collecting the cameras that had violated my privacy and seizing the computer equipment Thomas had used to profit from that violation. It felt like watching surgery being performed on an infected wound, painful but necessary for healing. Detective Chen provided a running commentary on the search process, explaining what types of evidence the officers were prioritizing and how they were preserving digital files that could be easily deleted or corrupted if handled improperly. The computer forensics team is making complete copies of all his hard drives and storage devices before examining any files. This ensures that even if he has remote access capabilities or automatic deletion programs, we'll have preserved everything he was trying to hide. The search took nearly 4 hours and yielded more evidence than even we had expected. In addition to the surveillance cameras and computer equipment, officers found detailed written records of Thomas's victims, financial documents showing the scope of his illegal income, and correspondence with customers that revealed the disturbing nature of his subscriber base. But perhaps most shocking was the discovery of additional storage devices hidden in his garage and basement, containing what appeared to be years of archived material from locations we hadn't known about. Thomas's criminal enterprise was far more extensive than our initial investigation had revealed. Mrs. Sullivan, Detective Chen said as officers completed their inventory of seized materials, "Your son has been operating this surveillance scheme for at least 3 years, possibly longer. We've identified evidence of cameras in more than 20 different locations, including the homes of elderly clients, a assisted living facility where he did maintenance work, and several businesses where he had legitimate access for construction projects." The scope of his crimes felt overwhelming and surreal. The son I'd raised to respect other people's dignity and privacy had systematically violated dozens of vulnerable individuals for financial gain. The caring facade he'd maintained while living with me was just one performance in a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. We returned to Marcus's apartment to wait for news of Thomas's arrest, which Detective Chen expected would happen when he returned home that evening. Marcus had created a comfortable space for me in his spare room, and his roommate Jake had graciously rearranged his schedule to help with anything I might need during this transition. The waiting was almost unbearable. Every phone call could bring news of Thomas's arrest or word that he'd somehow escaped justice. Marcus tried to distract me with conversation about his college classes and plans for the future, but both of us were too anxious to focus on normal topics. At 7:30 that evening, Detective Chen called with the news we'd been anticipating and dreading. "We arrested your son at his house about 20 minutes ago. He's being charged with multiple felonies related to illegal surveillance, invasion of privacy, elder abuse, and computer crimes. Additional charges will likely be filed as we continue analyzing the evidence we collected today." "How did he react when you arrested him?" "He seemed shocked at first, then became very angry and started demanding to know who had been snooping around his property. He specifically asked whether you or Marcus had been in his bedroom, which suggests he suspected you might have discovered something." The detective explained that Thomas would be held overnight and arraigned on Monday morning, when formal charges would be filed and bail would be set. "She warned us that he would likely try to contact me once he was allowed phone calls, and advised me not to accept those calls or agree to meet with him without legal representation present." "Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to understand that your son is going to be very angry about these charges, and he may try to convince you that you've misunderstood his activities or been manipulated by others into making false accusations. It's important that you remember what you saw with your own eyes and trust the evidence we've collected. That first night in Marcus's apartment, I lay awake thinking about the 20-year-old young man who'd graduated high school with plans to study engineering, who'd brought me flowers on Mother's Day and called when he was struggling with decisions about his future. Somewhere along the way, that person had become someone capable of installing cameras in my bedroom and selling footage of my most vulnerable moments to strangers on the internet. The transformation felt impossible to reconcile with my memories of raising him, but the evidence was undeniable. Thomas had made deliberate choices to exploit and harm people who trusted him, and those choices had consequences that would now reshape all our lives. Monday morning brought Thomas's arraignment and my first glimpse of him since his arrest. Marcus drove me to the courthouse, where Detective Chen had arranged for us to observe the proceedings from the gallery. I wasn't sure how I would react to seeing my son in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit, but I felt I needed to witness this moment for my own healing process. Thomas looked smaller and older than I remembered, his face pale and his expression shifting between anger and disbelief as the charges against him were read aloud. When his eyes found mine in the courtroom gallery, his expression changed to something I'd never seen before, a mixture of betrayal and rage that made me glad we were separated by distance and courthouse security. The prosecutor presented a summary of the charges and the evidence supporting them, including victim impact statements from several of Thomas's other targets who had been contacted after his arrest. The scope of harm he'd caused was staggering, including elderly clients who'd trusted him with keys to their homes, residents of assisted living facilities who'd believed their private spaces were secure, and business owners who'd hired him for legitimate construction work. Thomas's court-appointed attorney argued for reduced bail, claiming that his client had strong community ties and was not a flight risk. But the prosecutor countered with evidence of Thomas's sophisticated technical knowledge and the possibility that he'd hidden assets from his illegal activities in accounts that could facilitate escape. The judge set bail at $200,000, an amount that seemed unlikely Thomas could meet given his legitimate financial situation. He was remanded to county jail pending trial, with a preliminary hearing scheduled for the following month. As we left the courthouse, Detective Chen provided an update on the ongoing investigation into Thomas's criminal network. Federal authorities had joined the case due to evidence of interstate distribution of illegal material, and they were working to identify and contact all of his victims across multiple states. We've also discovered that your son was not working alone. The investigation has revealed communications with at least 3 other individuals who were providing him with access to vulnerable targets and helping distribute recorded material through online networks. This case is going to be much larger than we initially anticipated. The revelation that Thomas was part of a broader criminal conspiracy added another layer of horror to an already devastating situation. My son hadn't simply made individual bad choices, he'd deliberately joined an organized effort to exploit vulnerable people for profit. Over the following weeks, as investigators continued analyzing evidence and building their case, I began the difficult process of rebuilding my life and confronting the emotional impact of Thomas's betrayal. Marcus helped me return to my own house, where we conducted a thorough search for any surveillance equipment Thomas might have installed during his visits over the years. The process of reclaiming my own space felt both empowering and heartbreaking. Every room held memories of the son I thought I'd known, but now those memories were contaminated by knowledge of his secret activities and calculating assessment of my vulnerabilities. Marcus installed new locks and a security system that would alert us to any unauthorized entry, but more importantly, he helped me reconnect with neighbors and friends I'd lost touch with during my stay at Thomas's house. The isolation that had made me vulnerable to his exploitation began lifting as I re-established social connections and support networks. Physical therapy continued, and my mobility improved significantly once I was no longer being secretly medicated or manipulated into believing I was more impaired than the accident had actually left me. My mind cleared, my energy returned, and I began recognizing how much of my supposed decline had been artificially induced by Thomas's control over my environment and routine. The preliminary hearing in December provided our first detailed look at the prosecution's case against Thomas and his co-conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming and disturbing, revealing a sophisticated network of individuals who'd been systematically targeting vulnerable adults for surveillance and exploitation. Thomas's customer base included hundreds of subscribers who'd paid monthly fees for access to live feeds and archived footage of elderly people, disabled individuals, and others who'd been secretly recorded in their most private moments. The financial records showed he'd earned more than $300,000 over 3 years from this illegal enterprise. But perhaps most chilling was evidence of the detailed planning and coordination involved in selecting and targeting victims. Thomas and his associates had developed profiles of potential targets, identifying individuals who were isolated, dependent on caregivers, or otherwise unlikely to discover surveillance equipment in their homes. My own targeting hadn't been random or opportunistic. Thomas had deliberately chosen to exploit my accident and recovery as an opportunity to install cameras and profit from my vulnerability. Every gesture of care and concern had been calculated to maximize both my dependence and the voyeuristic appeal of my situation for his paying customers. The trial began in February, nearly 4 months after Thomas's arrest. I testified on the second day, describing my experience living in his house and the gradual discovery of his surveillance operation. The process of speaking publicly about such intimate violations felt difficult and embarrassing, but I was determined to ensure that Thomas faced full consequences for his crimes. Marcus also testified, explaining his technical analysis of the surveillance equipment and his role in gathering evidence of Thomas's illegal activities. His clear, detailed testimony helped the jury understand both the sophistication of the surveillance operation and the extensive planning required to target and exploit vulnerable individuals. The prosecution presented victim impact statements from 12 other people Thomas had surveilled, including elderly clients, assisted living residents, and employees at businesses where he'd installed hidden cameras. Their stories painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior that had caused lasting psychological harm to people who'd trusted him with access to their private spaces. Thomas's defense attorney attempted to portray him as someone who'd made poor choices due to financial desperation following his divorce, but the extensive evidence of planning and coordination made it impossible to characterize his crimes as impulsive or situational. The surveillance operation required technical expertise, careful victim selection, and ongoing management of criminal distribution networks. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, including elder abuse, invasion of privacy, computer crimes, and conspiracy charges related to his coordination with other members of the criminal network. At sentencing 2 weeks later, I was given the opportunity to address Thomas directly about the impact his crimes had on my life and recovery. Standing at the podium in that courtroom, looking at the son I'd raised and loved, I felt a complex mixture of grief, anger, and determination to speak truth about what he'd done. Thomas, you violated my trust and privacy in ways I'm still struggling to understand. You turned my recovery from injury into an opportunity for exploitation, and you monetized my vulnerability for strangers' entertainment. The son I raised would never have done these things to anyone, much less his own mother. But more than the personal betrayal, you've harmed dozens of innocent people who trusted you with access to their homes and private spaces. You've caused damage that will take years for your victims to heal from, and you've destroyed any possibility of the relationship we might have had. I hope you'll use your time in prison to reflect on the choices that brought you here and to develop genuine remorse for the harm you've caused. But I also want you to know that I'm proud of myself for having the courage to stop you from continuing to hurt people. Thomas was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with additional state sentences to run concurrently. His co-conspirators received similar sentences, and the criminal network that had exploited vulnerable adults across multiple states was effectively dismantled. The restitution process recovered most of the money Thomas had earned from his illegal activities, which was distributed among his victims to help cover counseling costs and security improvements for their homes. While no amount of money could undo the violations we'd experienced, the financial compensation provided practical support for rebuilding our sense of safety and privacy. A year after Thomas's sentencing, I was living independently in my own house again, with a security system that gave me confidence in my privacy and safety. Marcus had graduated from community college and started a 4-year program in computer science, specializing in cybersecurity with a focus on protecting vulnerable populations from technological exploitation. Our experience had transformed both of us, but in ways that ultimately made us stronger and more connected to our community. Marcus's technical skills and my experience as an educator led us to develop workshops for elderly adults about recognizing and protecting themselves from various forms of technological exploitation. We also worked with local law enforcement to improve training about elder abuse cases involving technology, helping officers understand the sophisticated methods predators use to target and exploit vulnerable adults. Detective Chen became a colleague and friend, inviting us to participate in community education programs about cyber safety and elder protection. The relationship between Marcus and me deepened through our shared experience of confronting Thomas's crimes and supporting each other through the legal process. He'd shown courage and determination in protecting me when I was most vulnerable, and I'd found strength I didn't know I possessed when faced with the need to seek justice. Looking back on those months of violation and exploitation, I felt grateful for the accident that had initially made me vulnerable. Without that injury and my need for care, I might never have discovered Thomas's criminal activities or been in a position to help stop him from continuing to harm others. The experience taught me that predators often hide behind facades of care and concern, exploiting the trust of people who need assistance or support. But it also showed me that communities of people who watch out for each other can identify and stop even sophisticated criminal operations when they work together with determination and courage. Thomas had tried to isolate me and make me dependent on him alone, but his crimes ultimately connected me to a larger network of survivors, advocates, and professionals committed to protecting vulnerable adults from exploitation. His attempt to profit from my vulnerability had instead empowered me to become an advocate for others facing similar threats. 2 years after his sentencing, I received a letter from Thomas in prison, asking for forgiveness and claiming he'd found religion and wanted to make amends for his crimes. I read the letter once and then threw it away without responding. Some violations are too fundamental to forgive, and some relationships are too damaged by betrayal to rebuild. But I wasn't bitter or consumed by anger about what he'd done. Instead, I focused my energy on the positive connections and meaningful work that had emerged from our confrontation with his crimes. Marcus and I continued our education and advocacy efforts, helping other families recognize and respond to technological exploitation. The house where I'd been secretly recorded and exploited had been sold, and Thomas's surveillance equipment had been destroyed by law enforcement. But the lessons I'd learned about recognizing predatory behavior and protecting myself and others would last for the rest of my life. At 75, I was more independent and socially connected than I'd been in years. My physical recovery from the accident was complete, but more importantly, my recovery from Thomas's psychological manipulation and exploitation had made me stronger and more confident in my ability to make decisions and protect myself from future threats. The grandson who'd saved me from continued violation had become a trusted partner in work that gave meaning to our shared experience of surviving and overcoming deliberate harm. Together we'd transformed a story of exploitation into a legacy of protection and empowerment for others facing similar vulnerabilities. Thomas's attempt to profit from my trust and dependence had ultimately failed. Instead of destroying my independence and dignity, his crimes had revealed my capacity for courage and resilience that I'd never been forced to access before. In trying to make me a victim, he'd accidentally helped me discover that I was a survivor with the strength to fight back and protect others from similar harm. The months following Thomas's sentencing brought unexpected challenges that I hadn't anticipated during the intensity of the investigation and trial. While I'd assumed that his imprisonment would mark the end of our ordeal, the reality proved far more complex and emotionally demanding than I'd prepared myself to handle. The first shock came 3 weeks after the sentencing, when Detective Chen called to inform me that federal investigators had uncovered additional evidence suggesting Thomas's criminal network had been larger and more sophisticated than even the extensive trial proceedings had revealed. Computer forensics specialists working through seized hard drives had discovered encrypted files containing thousands of hours of recorded material from locations across 7 states. Mrs. Sullivan, we've identified at least 40 additional victims who were surveilled without their knowledge, Detective Chen explained during a meeting at the police station. Many of these people don't even know they were targeted, and we're going to need your help in developing a victim notification process that minimizes trauma while ensuring everyone understands what happened to them. The prospect of 40 more families experiencing the shock and violation I'd endured felt overwhelming. Each of those victims would need to process the same feelings of betrayal, invasion, and loss of security that had dominated my life for months. The ripple effects of Thomas's crimes seemed to expand endlessly, touching lives in ways that wouldn't be fully understood for years. Marcus and I worked with federal victim advocates to develop notification protocols that would provide support resources alongside the devastating news that these individuals had been secretly recorded. The process required delicate balance between honesty about what had occurred and sensitivity to the psychological impact such revelations would have on people who'd trusted Thomas with access to their private spaces. One of the most difficult aspects of this expanded investigation was learning about victims who died during the years Thomas had been operating his surveillance network. Elderly clients who'd passed away from natural causes had no idea their final months or years had been recorded and distributed to strangers for entertainment. Their families faced the impossible task of grieving these additional violations alongside their existing loss. Mrs. Eleanor Davidson had been 89 when Thomas installed cameras in her assisted living apartment during what she believed was routine maintenance work. She died peacefully in her sleep 6 months before his arrest, never knowing that her private moments had been watched by hundreds of paying subscribers. Her daughter Patricia called me after receiving notification from federal investigators, seeking someone who could understand the unique pain of discovering such posthumous violations. I keep thinking about all the times she changed clothes or took her medication believing she was alone and safe, Patricia said during our phone conversation. She valued her dignity so much, especially as her health declined. Knowing that strangers were watching her during her most vulnerable moments feels like they stole something sacred from her memory. These conversations with other families affected by Thomas's crimes became a regular part of my life as the federal investigation continued expanding. Each victim's story was unique, but the common threads of betrayal, violation, and lost sense of security created bonds between people who'd never met but shared experiences that few others could truly understand. Marcus graduated from his computer science program and immediately began working with a cybersecurity firm that specialized in protecting vulnerable populations from technological exploitation. His experience with Thomas's case had given him insights into predatory surveillance methods that made him valuable to organizations developing protective technologies and training programs. During his job interview, Marcus explained how personal experience had shaped his career goals in ways that purely academic study never could have achieved. The interviewer, a woman named Dr. Sarah Martinez who specialized in elder protection technology, was particularly interested in Marcus's perspective on the psychological manipulation techniques Thomas had used alongside his technological surveillance. Understanding the technical aspects of hidden cameras and wireless transmission is important, Dr. Martinez told Marcus during their second interview, but recognizing the behavioral patterns that predators use to gain access and maintain control over their victims is equally crucial for developing effective protection strategies. Marcus's new position involved traveling to communities across the region, providing training to law enforcement, social services, and healthcare workers about recognizing and responding to technological exploitation of vulnerable adults. His presentations included detailed analysis of Thomas's methods, showing audiences how seemingly innocent maintenance requests or offers of assistance could mask sophisticated surveillance operations. Meanwhile, I continued my own advocacy work through speaking engagements at senior centers, community organizations, and professional conferences. The initial nervousness I'd felt about discussing such personal violations had evolved into determination to ensure other families didn't experience the isolation and confusion that had made Thomas's exploitation possible. During one particularly memorable presentation at a regional conference on elder protection, an audience member asked whether I ever regretted pursuing criminal charges against my own son. The question struck me as missing the fundamental point about accountability and protection that had motivated our actions from the beginning. Regret suggests I had other viable options that would have achieved better outcomes, I replied. But allowing Thomas to continue exploiting vulnerable people wasn't really an option once we understood the scope of his crimes. The choice wasn't between preserving family relationships and seeking justice. The choice was between protecting future victims and enabling continued harm. The question did prompt me to reflect more deeply on the emotional complexity of seeking justice against someone you've loved and raised. The grief I felt about losing the relationship I'd thought I had with Thomas was real and ongoing, separate from my certainty that pursuing criminal charges had been the right decision. Therapy became an important part of my healing process, particularly in addressing the ways Thomas's manipulation had affected my ability to trust my own judgment about people's motivations and character. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery for older adults, helped me understand how predators exploit both physical vulnerabilities and the social expectations that make elderly people reluctant to question caregivers' motives. Your son understood that you'd been socialized to be grateful for assistance and reluctant to seem ungrateful or suspicious, Dr. Walsh explained during one of our sessions. He deliberately exploited those social expectations to maintain access and control, while making you feel responsible for not recognizing his deception. The therapy process revealed how Thomas's psychological manipulation had been as damaging as his technological surveillance, systematically undermining my confidence in my own perceptions and decision-making abilities. Recognizing these manipulation techniques helped me develop stronger boundaries and more assertive communication skills that served me well in both personal relationships and advocacy work. 1 year after Thomas's sentencing, Marcus and I received an invitation to testify before a congressional subcommittee examining legislative responses to technological exploitation of vulnerable adults. The hearing focused on gaps in current laws and enforcement mechanisms that allowed predators like Thomas to operate undetected for extended periods. The experience of speaking to federal legislators about our case felt both intimidating and empowering. Marcus provided technical testimony about surveillance methods and detection technologies, while I focused on the psychological impact of exploitation and the importance of victim support services in recovery and prevention efforts. Congressman Michael Torres, who chaired the subcommittee, asked specifically about the role family members and social connections play in both enabling and preventing technological exploitation. His question allowed me to address one of the most important lessons I'd learned from our experience. Isolation is the predator's most important tool, I told the subcommittee. Thomas was able to exploit me because I'd become disconnected from people who might have noticed changes in my behavior or questioned his control over my environment. Strong social networks aren't just important for emotional support, they're essential for recognizing and responding to exploitation before it becomes entrenched. The legislative hearing resulted in proposed bills that would strengthen penalties for technological exploitation of vulnerable adults and provide funding for training programs like the ones Marcus and I had been developing. While the political process moved slowly, the hearing demonstrated growing recognition that technological crimes against elderly and disabled individuals required specialized legal and social service responses. During this same period, I began receiving letters from other victims of Thomas's surveillance network who'd learned about my advocacy work through news coverage of the congressional hearing. These communications provided insights into the diverse ways his crimes had affected different people's lives and recovery processes. Robert Chen, a 78-year-old man who'd hired Thomas for home maintenance work, wrote about the anxiety and paranoia he'd experienced since learning about the hidden cameras in his bedroom. Despite Thomas's imprisonment, Robert struggled with persistent fears that other unknown surveillance devices might still be monitoring his activities. I've had 3 different security companies inspect my house, and I've replaced all my locks twice, but I still can't shake the feeling that someone might be watching, Robert wrote. The rational part of my brain knows Thomas is in prison and can't hurt me anymore, but the emotional part feels like my privacy was permanently destroyed. These letters reinforced my understanding that recovery from technological exploitation involved more than just removing surveillance equipment and prosecuting perpetrators. The psychological damage from discovering that private spaces had been violated created lasting anxiety and hypervigilance that required ongoing support and professional intervention. Dr. Walsh helped me develop strategies for responding to these communications in ways that provided emotional support without overstepping the boundaries of my advocacy role. She emphasized the importance of connecting victims with professional counseling services while acknowledging the unique value of peer support from others who'd experienced similar violations. The second anniversary of Thomas's arrest brought an unexpected development when his former co-conspirator, Richard Martinez, was released from federal prison after serving a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation with ongoing investigations. Detective Chen called to inform me of his release and to discuss safety precautions given his knowledge of my role in exposing their criminal network. Martinez has been cooperative throughout the investigation and hasn't made any threats, but we think you should be aware of his release and take reasonable precautions about your personal security, Detective Chen explained. His cooperation helped us identify and prosecute several other members of their network, but he's also someone who lost significant income and freedom because of your decision to come forward. The reminder that people connected to Thomas's crimes were returning to society brought back anxieties I'd worked hard to manage through therapy and advocacy work. Marcus immediately offered to install additional security measures at my house and to increase the frequency of his visits until we could assess whether Martinez's release posed any actual threat to my safety. But rather than retreating into fear and isolation, I decided to use this development as an opportunity to strengthen my connections with local law enforcement and expand my network of people who were aware of my situation and committed to my protection. The experience with Thomas had taught me that isolation made exploitation possible, while strong social connections provide both security and early warning systems for potential threats. I contacted several neighbors who'd become friends during my recovery process, explaining the situation and asking them to be particularly attentive to any unusual activity around my property. I also worked with Detective Chen to develop a communication protocol that would allow me to quickly alert authorities if I noticed anything concerning about Martinez's behavior or whereabouts. The security measures proved unnecessary, as Martinez appeared focused on rebuilding his own life rather than seeking retribution against the people who'd exposed his crimes. 6 months after his release, Detective Chen informed me that he'd found legitimate employment and was complying with all terms of his supervised release without any indication of interest in contacting Thomas's victims. This experience reinforced important lessons about balancing reasonable caution with the determination to continue living actively and engaged with my community. The goal wasn't to eliminate all possible risks, but to manage them intelligently while refusing to allow fear to constrain my choices about how to spend my time and energy. As I approached my 77th birthday, I reflected on the unexpected ways that surviving Thomas's exploitation had enriched and deepened my life in directions I could never have anticipated. The advocacy work that had emerged from our experience provided purpose and meaning that retirement from teaching had never quite replaced. Marcus, now established in his cybersecurity career and engaged to a wonderful woman named Lisa, who shared his commitment to protecting vulnerable populations, had become not just my grandson but a trusted colleague and friend whose insights and support had been essential to my healing process. The house where I'd lived for decades had been transformed from a place of isolation and vulnerability into a center of activity and connection, with regular visits from other advocacy workers, victim families seeking support, and law enforcement professionals consulting on protection strategies. Most importantly, I'd discovered reserves of strength, courage, and resilience that I'd never been required to access during the more conventional challenges of my earlier life. The woman who'd been terrified and confused by Thomas's manipulation had evolved into someone capable of speaking truth to power and demanding accountability from institutions and individuals who'd failed to protect vulnerable people. The relationship with Thomas remained permanently severed, a decision I'd never regretted despite occasional moments of sadness about losing the son I'd thought I knew. His continued imprisonment served as both protection for potential future victims and consequence for choices that had caused irreparable harm to dozens of families. But the broader family that had emerged from our confrontation with his crimes, including Marcus, Detective Chen, Dr. Walsh, and the network of advocates and survivors we'd connected with, provided relationships based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine commitment to each other's well-being. Looking forward, I felt optimistic about continuing this work for as long as my health and energy allowed, knowing that each person we educated about technological exploitation and each policy we influenced toward better protection might prevent other families from experiencing the violations and betrayals that had marked our own journey. The cameras that had once violated my privacy were gone, but the clarity of vision I'd gained about predatory behavior, community protection, and personal resilience would guide the rest of my life toward greater purpose and deeper connections than I'd ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.